You're mid-sentence in your target language, feeling confident, and then out of nowhere, a word from a different language hijacks your brain. Ah, me encanta. Mais en fait... You aren't just forgetting a word, you're experiencing a cognitive glitch where two languages are fighting for the same space. But what if I told you this isn't a lack of fluency, but a specific mechanical failure in how your brain activates phonology? If you're new to the channel, I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I'm an avid language learner, and I've got a PhD in linguistics. On the channel, I talk about language, linguistics, language learning, and culture. If you're into those topics, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. A lot of you have asked me why you can't stop mixing up languages and how to stop. In fact, I decided to make this video when I got 2 emails in 1 hour asking the same thing. So today we're getting into it. Why does this happen and what can you do about it? The great news is we know more or less exactly what's going on. The less great news is that while there are strategies to minimize it that I'll share, it's not a problem that's completely fixable. I have to say this a surprising amount to my channel, but the important takeaway is that there's nothing wrong with you. You're doing great. Let's get into it. Questo e... No. This is Language Jones. So mixing up languages. First, the why. Why do we mix up languages at all? To understand that, we need to understand production models of speech. For a long time, the basic idea was that switching languages was like switching train tracks. You flip a switch, the track jumps over, the train switches to the other track, and you're on that track now. But that's been pretty much conclusively ruled out. To understand why, we need to understand modern neurolinguistic conceptions of how we actually produce speech in our first language. There's a lot of competing models of speech production, and they all have super cool names like trace. I'm not going to detail them all, but I'll give you what I think of as the big takeaway and how I conceive of things from a survey of the literature. Neuroscientists, feel free to have arguments in the comments. Any model has to explain a path that covers 3 things. Steal underpants, and profit.
You see, phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit.
No, wait, sorry. Concept, lemma, and phonology. That's how you go from having an idea in your head to figuring out what words go with it to actually how you make the sounds of the words. An early theory was that the process was just that. Have an idea, select a lemma that is a basic mapping of a concept to an abstract idea of a word, and then that gets mapped to the phonology. How you make sounds to actually say the word. Study after study has complicated that picture, and the general consensus now is that you have an idea. That idea is associated with some level of neural activation, and it can inhibit some other patterns of activation and excite similar patterns. Almost immediately you get lemma activation, meaning a bunch of different words that all relate to your concept get partially activated in the brain, and then you almost simultaneously get phonological activation. These are overlapping and what they call cascading activations. So as you're thinking a concept, say this fuzzy little guy, your brain is activating the concept of a puppy, but also the concept of a dog more broadly, and related concepts like kittens and tribbles, and all of those are activating things like dog, dogs, puppy, puppies, kitten, tribble, canine, as well as things that aren't even nouns like fuzzy, cute, and so on. And each of those is activating some of the associated sounds. There's a whole world of studies here too looking at syllable structure and overlapping phonological distinctive features and so on. Normally, the cascading activations will still just result in the right word for the concept finally making it out of your mouth, but in some instances you can get conflict, and there's more when they're phonologically similar and in similar conceptual domains. That's why you might mix up kitten and canine more easily than puppy and cat. Kitten and canine share a k, a n, and one level up, they share both syllable structure, 2 syllables, and stress pattern. The first syllable is stressed. And now for the bad news. As far as we can tell, multiple languages may have a slightly different center of gravity in the brain, but they're stored largely in overlapping areas of the brain. Say you're speaking French. The cascading activation from concept to lemma to sound is happening in French, while also activating your other foreign languages, we'll say Spanish, and your first language. I'll get back to how we ever speak another language at all in just a minute. So the problem is one of interference and priming, and there's some really interesting empirical evidence here. First, on lexical priming, that is, words. One study gave Dutch and English bilinguals, an overly complicated way of saying Dutch people, a picture to identify, with a target word like mountain. The trick is they played words while they asked people to label the pictures they gave them. When they played the English word mouth, it primed mountain, because they start with the same sounds. Priming means it was easier for them to come up with the word mountain faster. When they played the Dutch word mouw, which means sleeve, it also accelerated people's ability to produce the word mountain. Here's what's interesting about that. First, neither word is semantically related. Mouth and sleeve don't have to do with mountains. Second, both words accelerated recall, meaning even when you're doing a say a word in English task, you haven't just flipped a switch where Dutch has no effect on you. You're not on that other train track. They also found that semantics can prime or impede, meaning when you play phonologically unrelated words like dal, which means valley, it actually slows down production of the right word. If we kept our languages totally separate, maybe you could say sounds just prime sounds, but that's a sound thing and not a language thing. But then an unrelated word in Dutch should have no impact on your ability to produce the right word in English. Instead, when it's semantically related, it can accelerate or impede production. And from personal experience, I can attest to this. It took me precisely no time to memorize the word for strange in Hebrew, muzar. Sounds like bizarre. And the main difference is one that even shares some distinctive features. M and B are not as different as, say, M and K. If you want to know more about why that is, you might be interested in the new course that I'm launching called the Linguistics Blueprint. You can sign up for updates and to get on the waitlist at languagejones.com/blueprint. It'll cover things like distinctive feature theory, but also morphology, syntax, semantics, and even sociolinguistics and pragmatics. I'll leave a link in the description and a pinned comment. Anyway, that phonological and semantic priming finally provided me with an answer for why mnemonics, which I hate and think are stupid, actually work. I hate that they work, but they really, really do. We also see syntactic priming when structures are similar. For instance, Spanish and English passives are similar to one another. The truck is chased by the taxi. El camión es perseguido por el taxi. And indeed, there's a priming effect where exposure to one is associated with an increased use of the same structure when speaking the other language for a little while after exposure. That's what priming is. This also happens with things like the English and German double object constructions like I gave him a letter. More dissimilar structures don't prime each other though, so German and English passives have a much less robust priming effect than Spanish and English.
Der Fluss wurde von dem chemischen Abfall vergiftet.
The river was by the chemical waste poisoned. Doesn't prime an English passive the same. So how do bilinguals, even speak another language? The main concept is bilingual control, which relies on suppression. But how? Well, we're not 100% sure, honestly. That train track metaphor was relatively dominant for a long time, but it doesn't really hold water to egregiously mix metaphors. It's sometimes referred to as the language switch hypothesis, but study of it did provide us with one really, really weird finding. When you provide people with an Arabic numeral and you color code what language you want them to say it in, for instance, French in red, English in blue, if you have a couple in French, it's actually harder to switch back to English. They call this the paradoxical switch cost. One theory is that there's an involuntary persistence of task set, meaning you're really focused on speaking the other language. The insight from this might be, as Traxler explains, first, L2 labels are normally too weakly activated to compete with L1 labels for expression during speech. Second, when speaking in the L2, a strong general suppression mechanism reduces the activation of L1 labels to the point where they do not prevent L2 phonological representations from controlling the speech output process. So we just tamp it down real hard. The current preferred model of bilingual activation is called BIA+. It's built on Trace+. There will not be a test on this. Traxler does a great job of explaining, so I'm going to quote him here discussing Dijkstra and Van Heuven's work. The Dutch are all over the bilingual stuff. So Trace+, keeping track of which language is most activated, feature, letter, or phoneme, and word nodes, and most activated language. Any particular input to the system will activate multiple potential matching candidates, and partially activated lexical representations will compete with one another for selection. This competition can take place within a single language, as when cat competes with car, cap, and can, but it can also take place across languages. For example, imagine that a bilingual subject is trying to judge whether two words from different languages mean the same thing, the translation judgment task. The Spanish word cara might activate the English word card because they look and sound similar. They're related in form. The Spanish word cara might activate the English word head because cara means face, and face is associated with head, a kind of semantic relation. In fact, when Spanish-English bilinguals judge whether two words are translation equivalents, that is, they have the same meaning, they false alarm to both form-related and semantically related distractors. So rather than neatly activating just the English translation equivalent, the Spanish word activates a set of English candidates that are related to the Spanish word both by virtue of looking and sounding like it, a kind of orthographic or phonological neighborhood effect, or by virtue of having a similar meaning, a kind of semantic neighborhood effect. Thus, we can use the same principles that we used to understand monolingual lexical access to understand bilingual lexical access. Both involve simultaneous activations of multiple candidates followed by competition and selection of the best matching candidate. So now the $64,000 question, what can we do to limit interference across languages? What can we do to stop mixing up languages now that we understand all that stuff? First, we have to recognize that the problem is one of inhibitory control available to us. Don't worry if you have ADHD, there's actually robust evidence that bilinguals with ADHD do better at these tasks. That's from a 2025 dissertation, so I don't have much more to say about it because the studies are just still ongoing. But we know there's an influence from the environment. Talking to an L1 speaker and an L2 speaker is harder than just an L2 speaker. If you make it just all L2 all the time, you're going to have an easier time. Linguistic context also plays a part. When one word is strongly primed in one language from context, the others are suppressed. For example, there's a constraining context. I went down to the bank and deposited all my. What do I mean by constraining? Well, that's more constraining than I would like to have some. And there's a whole world of executive control, interference and suppression, and response inhibition. This is where ADHDers start getting nervous, but like I said, I was surprised by the research. It just doesn't support the idea that ADHD makes bilingual interference suppression harder. But practically, what do? Unfortunately, some amount of this is just not solvable. But here are some recommendations. 1. If you're an asymmetrical bilingual, meaning one language is stronger than another, focus on improving memory and recall for the weaker language, especially vocabulary. If your vocabulary isn't locked in as well as you think it is, you're just going to be activating whatever is. 2. Be aware when in, and maybe avoid, environments that prime interference. I once had to translate between Chinese and French in real time. By about 2 minutes in, I was listening in French and then turning to the Chinese speaker and repeating the French. And my brain was practically melting out of my ears. 3. Cultivate phonological and semantic differences with cognates. 4. Don't learn related languages in active study at the same time, for instance, Italian and Spanish, if possible. Trust me on this one. You can, and all the cognates will prime one another, so there can be a benefit, especially for reading. But if you want to speak one well, you're going to want to avoid trying to develop them both at the same time. At least alternate a few months on one and then on another. 5. Hyper-focus on differences in pronunciation and syntax. Intentionally work on areas that are different and don't prime one another where you could get interference. That means really focus on the phonology and phonetics of each language and dig into those differences. Get really good at how a Dutch S is different than an English S, or whatever. Lastly, use external cues. For instance, wear a fake mustache or a beret when speaking French. You think I'm kidding? I'm not kidding. More practical, lean into the personality shift people imagine with embodied and enrobed cognition. Years ago, my then girlfriend asked me why I pretentiously made French face when speaking French. The answer was partially that that's just how you say U, but it was also a bit of cultural accommodation and embodied cognition. When I speak French, I have resting French face. Recognize when you slip up, it's not a moral failure. It's just how our brains work. But you can use these tips to try to limit how and when your slip-ups occur. And as a bonus, you need stalling material so you can continue to speak while you're searching for the right word. Just a quick reminder, if you're interested in learning the basics of linguistics from the ground up, with no background necessary, I'm launching a digital course later this year called The Linguistics Blueprint. You can sign up for updates and get on the waitlist at www.languagejones.com/blueprint. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you can support it on YouTube with super thanks or over on Patreon at patreon.com/languagejones. Please leave me a comment. They are great for the algorithm. And subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, happy learning.